After the disaster of convoy PQ-17 in June 1942, there had only been one other outbound Arctic convoy, that being PQ-18, which sailed in September. Beyond that, there was a suspension of convoy sailings throughout mid and late 1942 while the Royal Navy took stock. This period extended past the danger zone expressed by extended daylight hours and clearer weather due to demand from other operational areas, particularly Operation Torch, and the 40-strong planned PQ-19 was thus disbanded, leading instead to Operation FB, where various ships tried to make it, mostly alone, to Russian ports instead. This didn't go quite as disastrously as you might expect, at least by PQ-17 standards, as the combination of increased hours of darkness as winter closed in, along with the accompanying appalling weather, made surface detection and attack nearly impossible. And these factors, plus the transfer of the majority and the best of Luftwaffe 5's attack aircraft to go after the Allied shipping in the aforementioned Operation Torch, meant that, apart from, of course, the ever-present U-boat threat, the only real aerial threat to these now rather hard-to-find lone ships was a small collection of whatever aircraft had essentially been deemed unsurvivable in the face of modern anti-aircraft opposition and thus left in Norway. As a result, the majority of the ships involved, heading both east and west in Operation FB, did actually survive, but it was also to be the final footnote to the PQ convoy series. But fast forward a few months, and the USSR still needed supplies, and most of the fighting associated with Operation Torch was done. So it was decided to revive the Arctic convoys. But the old PQ and QP series designations for outbound and returning convoys respectively was replaced with a new series that would last to the end of the war, this being the JW and RA series. This all kicked off in mid-December 1942 with convoy JW51A, consisting of 16 merchant ships accompanied for the main part of the voyage by a minesweeper, 2 corvettes, and 2 trawlers, these serving as close escort. 6 interwar-era destroyers were nearby, with a cruiser covering force consisting of 2 light cruisers and 3 destroyers, and a distant force of the battleship King George V, the heavy cruiser Berwick, and 3 more destroyers. This was a significantly less powerful escort force than had notionally covered PQ-17, but the level of cover had been dictated in part by the deep Arctic winter, making attack less likely, and the only German capital ship present in Norway, Tirpitz, had been moved south for a much-needed refit. Thus, the heaviest Kriegsmarine units present were the heavy cruisers Lutzow and Admiral Hipper, as the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, also in need of a refit, had gone with Tirpitz, but then continued even further south, fetching up in Germany. The Scharnhorst and Prince Eugen were due to be assigned to Norway, but that wouldn't happen until early 1943, pending the arrival of more fuel, as even Tirpitz's abortive sailing against PQ-17 had eaten heavily into available reserves. So the convoy escort was in total more than powerful enough to deal with a couple of heavy cruisers and accompanying destroyers. For their own part, the Germans had been primed to exploit their successes against the PQ convoys, but then the long absence of Allied efforts in that regard had first led to boredom, and then the decision to send the aforementioned ship south for repairs and overhauls. In the event, this resumption of Allied convoys actually went completely unnoticed by the Germans, and thus JW51A managed to slip past the aircraft and U-boats that were out on general patrol without any hindrance or loss. Although the air threat was diminished by weather and the reduced numbers of aircraft available, the submarine threat nonetheless remained high, in part because Hitler was still obsessed with the idea of an Allied invasion of Norway, and hence why the convoy escort formation still retained a reasonable number of smaller warships. You might also note, though, that at just 16 ships strong, JW51A was much smaller than most of the PQ convoys. This was due to an argument that had occurred between Admiral Tovey and London. After PQ-17, Tovey had recommended that there should be more numerous, small, fast convoys. These, he argued, would be easier to manage. They would allow the use of a smaller pool of somewhat faster merchant ships, and would therefore not only be quicker, but they would need fewer escorts per sailing, thus freeing up resources. London, on the other hand, had wanted a resumption of big convoys, several dozen merchant ships strong, and the compromise had been to split the originally planned large convoy into two, hence JW51A instead of JW51, which made the merchantman more manageable, but still ensured that a decent amount of overall supplies would reach the USSR. There was also the theory that, since these convoys ran more frequently, escorts from the previous convoy who were heading home would be available on call to help those of the loaded convoy that was following on from them if needed. Thus, 7 days after JW51A sailed, JW51B departed, consisting of 15 merchant ships with a close escort that once again was made up of a minesweeper, 2 corvettes and 2 trawlers, in this case the Bramble, Hyderabad, Rhododendron, Visalma and Northern Gem, respectively, with command exercised by Commander Rust aboard the Bramble. On the leg from Scotland to Iceland, 3 Hunt-class destroyers helped to escort the convoy. Thanks to the closeness of sailing between the 2 convoys, these are actually the same 3 ships that had performed the same duty for JW51A. The main destroyer escort was made up of 2 older destroyers, the Achates and Bulldog, plus 5 wartime emergency destroyers from the O class, the Obdurate, Obedient, Onslow, Oribe, and Orwell. These came under the command of Captain Sherbrooke, who was aboard the Onslow. As reports indicated that JW51A had finally been noticed on final approach to Russian ports by some beleaguered German aerial reconnaissance efforts, Sherbrooke guessed that German aerial and surface units would be out looking for his convoy. So he drew up a rather simple plan. In the event of surface attack, the 2 older destroyers would be in charge of laying a smokescreen to cover the convoy and acting as a reserve force, while the mostly identical O-class ships formed the main battle line in opposition to the enemy. Although this plan would take a bit of a setback, as heavy weather on the way to Iceland damaged the Bulldog badly enough that she had to turn back for repairs and would thus not be able to accompany the convoy. Distant cover came in the form of 2 formations. More distantly was Admiral Fraser aboard the battleship HMS Anson with a heavy cruiser Cumberland and 5 destroyers, 3 of them fleet types and 2 of them Hunt class, while a little bit closer but somewhat more transient was part of JW51A's covering force, the light cruisers Sheffield and Jamaica and the destroyers Matchless and Opportune, which would sail from the Kola Inlet on the 27th of December ahead of the return convoy, RA-51, which would take the rest of its escorts with it. The idea being that this cruiser formation under Admiral Burnett, designated Force R, would pass through the area of maximum danger just before JW-51B, and thus ideally catch any German ships on their way to attack the convoy, and if not, they'd be nearby just in case and could double back to shadow the convoy. True to Sherbrooke's prediction, on the 24th of December, the convoy was spotted by German aerial recon aircraft, and, unknown to the convoy, the U-354 used these reports to begin tracking the convoy as well. Captain Herbsheib assessed that his lone submarine was out of position for an ideal attack, and with so many radar and ASDIC-equipped ships in the escort formation, it was better to keep an eye on it, report its position, and then possibly attack later on as part of a larger effort. The weather then conspired to deteriorate further. Visibility dropped to 0, crew had to head out on deck roped to their ships for safety in order to clear ice build-up from their pitching and rolling vessels, and the temperature dropped so much that the internal water pipes began to freeze on some ships, and some of them even found their interior bulkheads were covered in ice, obviously on the inside. Unsurprisingly, equipment soon began to fail. The destroyer Oribe had her gyro compass and radar knocked out by the blow of an especially powerful wave, and with her magnetic compass rather thrown out by operating so close to the North Pole, she had no other form of navigation available, since the weather precluded sun, star, or moon sightings. The ship was thus forced to act like a medieval sailing ship and just head vaguely south in the hope of finding land without crashing into it, and then following that land eastward until they reached Russia. An effort which, believe it or not, would succeed, in part because the Germans just didn't anticipate a British destroyer rocking up in shouting distance of the occupied Norwegian coastline, so they weren't looking for her. And the appalling weather would have made any efforts in this regard fruitless, even if they had been trying. But it did of course mean the convoy escort was down another ship. And Oribe wasn't the only ship to go missing. The Jefferson Myers and the Daldorch had their deck cargoes, bombers, start to shift and threaten to break loose, which in the latter case actually occurred. Both ships hove to in attempts to secure the aircraft, and this meant that the rest of the ships on the port column of the convoy, unable to see anything except the vague shape of the ship in front, ended up following them and thus losing touch with the main convoy. The trawler Visalma went with them, as she likewise had been navigating mainly by keeping station on the central ship of the port column, and thus followed her when she went off course. The freighter Dover Hill was badly damaged by the weather and forced to turn back. On the evening of the 28th of December, with the weather moderating slightly, Sherbrooke reformed the remaining 9 merchantmen and then sent Commander Rust in the Bramble to find the others. Although small and lightly armed, Bramble was relatively new, having only been commissioned in 1939, and as such she was fitted with a fairly new surface search radar set, which it was felt would allow her to more quickly locate the errant vessels. The next day, most of the missing merchant ships made it back to the formation. The Visalma and the freighter Chester Valley had established that they were somewhere north of the convoy, and would try and meet up with them, and Bramble, of course, was still off searching for the Jefferson Myers. Also on the 29th, Admiral Burnett's Force R had finished their western sweep and come about to head roughly east, somewhat south and ahead of the convoy, with plans to arrive north of his original starting point of Kola late on the 30th and then head northwest to pass the convoy and take up station to the northwest of it for its final passage. U-354, meanwhile, had made occasional sightings of the convoy through gaps in weather, and thanks to the Oribe and Visalma wandering off and the detachment of Bramble, together with generally poor spotting conditions, the U-boat saw fewer escorts, and therefore signalled that the convoy now appeared to be weakly escorted, and that with improving weather, it would attempt to make an attack. The sub therefore spent the night of the 29th through 30th working its way ahead of the convoy on the surface, which was no fun for the crew, as if you thought Arctic storms were bad in a ship that was actually designed for surface sailing, now try replicating that experience in a pint-sized Type 7C. In any case, on the morning of the 30th, the submarine made its move, but was almost immediately spotted by the Obdurat's sensors. The destroyer moved to ram, but the U-boat dived in time and managed to make good its escape, although it cost the sub its position ahead of the convoy and left it in pursuit again. Based on the U-boat's reports, the Germans decided to risk their surface forces, and at 1800 on the 30th, the cruisers Hipper and Lutzow sailed along with 6 destroyers, the Friedrich Eckold, Richard Beitzen, and Theodor Riedel, along with the Z-30, Z-31, and Z-29. They left under standard Kriegsmarine orders for the war: destroy the convoy, but don't engage a superior enemy force. Appended to this was also a direct order not to rescue survivors, as well as a direction to Lutzow to make a break for the Atlantic after the destruction of the convoy. Since the presence of Allied submarines across the direct course to the convoy was known, or at least heavily suspected, the German formation first headed northwest to bypass this line before swinging around and heading northeast. As they settled into the interception course, they received still further orders not even to engage an enemy of similar strength, presumably in case they were damaged, particularly with a view to Lutzow's follow-up assignment. As the 30th turned into the 31st, Admiral Kumetz was further informed that aerial reconnaissance had discovered that 2 cruisers had left Kola. This, of course, was Burnett's force, although obviously they had left some days previously. Although on the plus side, the U-626 had managed to find and join U-354 in its pursuit efforts. Dubbed Operation Regenbogen, the German plan was to form a large skirmish line, with Hipper at one end to the north and Lutzow at the other end to the south, with the destroyers strung between them. They would then head for the convoy's reported position, with the aim to make contact using the destroyers, which would leave the 2 cruisers, theoretically, on either side of the convoy. With contact established, the Hipper and Lutzow would close in from both sides while the destroyers fell back to support them, catching the convoy in a pincer movement. Unknowingly, it was a plan that, on paper, was the perfect foil to Sherbrooke's plan, since his plan envisaged a German surface force coming at them from the south, and therefore his destroyers would be left fighting Lutzow and her escort, while Hipper and its escort fell on the convoy, which would only have a couple of corvettes and a trawler left to protect it. At 07:15 on the morning of the 31st, lookouts aboard the Hipper spotted some elements of the convoy. The sweep was a little bit to the south of where it ideally should have been, but since this was deep in the Arctic winter, it was still quite dark, and so the German ships began to form their attack groups, while Hipper slowed and broke contact to work into a better attack position, leaving her 3 destroyers, the Friedrich Eckholt, Richard Beitzen, and Z-29, to keep in contact. Ideally, thanks to the limited number of ships in the German formation with radar that was useful for gunnery, Kumetz wanted to attack a little bit later in the day, where the brief appearance of the sun over the horizon would allow them to use optical rangefinders as well. As what passed for dawn approached, the weather began to improve, the wind calmed somewhat, and the waves were a little less energetic, although they were still quite large. The temperature was still well below freezing, though, and improving visibility was something that came and went, with a line of snow squalls sweeping over the area, with better visibility generally found to the south, getting considerably worse as you went north. But at 08:20, the Hyderabad spotted something aft on its radar. At first, thinking it might be one of the missing ships or even a Russian destroyer, she said nothing immediately. But Obdurat's lookouts visually identified 3 German destroyers shortly thereafter. Sherbrooke ordered the ship to investigate, and the German destroyers fell back northwest towards Hipper. At 09:30, with a range down to about 8,000 yards, they opened fire on Obdurat as she gained on them. Sherbrooke had been keeping an eye on things and saw the gun flashes in the distant gloom. Obdurat immediately doubled back, and Sherbrooke ordered his own Onslow, plus Orwell and Obedient, to form up with the returning Obdurat, while Achates and the corvettes were to lay smoke across the rear of the convoy. As the British escort reacted, so too did Kumetz aboard Hipper. He ordered Hipper to proceed east at full speed to meet up with his destroyers and close on the convoy, while Lutzow and its 3 destroyers were to form up and head northeast to close the trap. As Hipper swung about, her profile was revealed to the British destroyers as a heavy cruiser, and so at 09:40 both sides broke radio silence. Kumetz to report he was attacking the convoy, and Sherbrooke to inform all in the area of the presence of the enemy. Hipper now opened fire on the British destroyers, as initially in the low visibility it had been thought that they might be the Germans' own. This was not the last time that poor conditions would make for an incorrect visual identification on this day, but when Achates began laying smoke, it was quite clear that these ships were not German. Obedient and Onslow used their own radar to open fire at around 10,500 yards before swinging about to match the course of Hipper and her 3 destroyers. The Germans drew away to the north, surprising Sherbrooke given that he was outnumbered 2-1 and outmassed over 7-1. Until he remembered, of course, he had torpedoes, and in the darkness, the range was such that he was, theoretically at least, at the outer edges of their effective range. Concluding, correctly, that the Germans were under orders not to risk their heavy ships against his torpedoes, Sherbrooke proceeded to then conduct an unequal but violent skirmish, occasionally making a brief dash at the German formation, complete with training his torpedo launchers at them and faking launches to scare them into drawing away further. which of course forced the Germans further away from the convoy, and would buy time for the Obedient and the Obdurate to join up with him. The convoy, seeing the action and the smoke behind them and to port, altered course southeast, unknowingly heading straight towards Lützow and her companions. But Sherbrooke was now cautious. The 3 German destroyers had vanished into the darkness and the haze, and he feared that Hipper might be drawing them off to allow the destroyers to work around him and hit the convoy, so he ordered Obdurate and Obedient to head back to the convoy to help with the smoke laying, while Onslow and Orwell kept snarling and snapping at Hipper to keep it away. As they did so, they were informed of 2 things which gladdened them immensely. Firstly, Hipper was breaking off and heading north, and secondly, Admiral Burnett's Force R was heading their way, and was approaching from the same direction as Hipper was headed off to. Burnett, who'd only ever had the vaguest idea of where the convoy actually was, since the weather meant that dead reckoning was practically useless for the convoy to work out its actual position and report it accurately, had initially kept heading northwest, thinking that the convoy was actually far further north than it was, thinking that was compounded by radar reporting contacts in that direction. But shortly after 0900, these were identified as the Visalma and the Chester Valley. Knowing that they were north of the convoy, Burnett then swung about south, and soon thereafter was rewarded by the sight of gunfire flashes still further south. Initially there was still a bit of confusion, as exactly where the stragglers were relative to the convoy was still in doubt, but soon Burnett decided that, well, in the absence of further information, it was best to follow Royal Navy tradition and steer for the sound of the guns, and so Force R cranked up to full speed and drove south. It was now 10:15. Lützow and her destroyers were actually only about 14,000 yards south of the convoy, but were unable to see them, thanks to the weather, as the 2 courses converged. But, as if sensing this, Hipper, whose gunnery thus far had been singularly ineffective, suddenly reversed course and drove at the 2 British destroyers with all guns blazing. Onslow was soon hit by 4 8-inch shells, knocking out her forward guns and radar, severing the radio antenna, blowing the funnel in 2, putting a hole in the engine room, and showering the bridge with shrapnel. Dead and wounded were everywhere. The ship was both on fire and taking on water, and Sherbrooke had taken a faceful of shrapnel, including 1 large piece of German steel that had hit him hard enough to temporarily dislodge his left eye. But, mostly unfazed by all of this, he regained his feet, organised damage control efforts, and, as Onslow lost speed, ordered Lieutenant Commander Kinloch in the Obedient to take over flotilla command. Orwell made smoke to cover Onslow's withdrawal as shells rained down around both ships, but then a snow squall swept over Hipper and her fire slackened as she turned away from pursuing. Satisfied that matters were in hand, Sherbrooke finally let himself be persuaded that eyes did in fact belong inside one's skull, and was duly sent down below for medical attention. The corvette Rhododendron now reported smoke from a large ship heading northeast spotted just southeast of the convoy. At first, this report was doubted, as it was almost directly opposite the last known location of Hipper, and they thought maybe the coordinates got transposed. But it was, of course, Lützow, now less than 3,500 yards from the convoy. But the German ships were caught in another snow squall, and instead of attacking as they crossed the convoy's T, they just kept going, apparently awaiting better visibility. Meanwhile, towards the northeast, a message came in from the Bramble. The sub-900-ton minesweeper had been making best speed to rejoin the convoy when a break in the weather revealed a cruiser dead ahead. This was, of course, Hipper. Such was the range that Bramble had no chance of escape, and upon seeing the German cruiser's 8-inch turrets rotate to bear on her, Commander Rust appears to have decided that if he was going to go down, he wasn't going down without a fight, and so the veteran of 8 outbound Arctic convoys swung about and actually beat Hipper to the punch, opening fire with both of her 4-inch deck guns. It was, of course, a fight that could only end one way, though, and Bramble was soon overwhelmed by Hipper's gunfire, with Kumetz leaving the Friedrich Eckholt to finish off the gallant little minesweeper, who'd gone down with all hands. Hipper had, by this point, travelled far enough east that she was now northeast, almost east-northeast, of the convoy, and heading back south again to engage, while Lützow had come up past the convoy, which led to an odd sighting when Obedient spotted Lutzow to the east, at which point the German ship seemed to open fire, but no shells landed. In fact, the flashes were the guns of Hipper, which was directly behind Lutzow relative to Obedient as she finished firing on Bramble. The German pincer had failed, as the arms of it had snapped shut ahead of the convoy and left all the German ships east-northeast of said convoy. However, it was still a situation of 2 heavy cruisers and 6 large destroyers against just 3 fully operational O-class, plus the damaged Onslow, the older Achates, the 2 trawlers, and the 1 corvette still left in the formation. As Lutzow's course revealed Hipper behind her, the latter opened fire on Achates, with Lutzow still remaining oddly silent. Soon an 8-inch shell hit the old destroyer, wiping out the bridge and the super-firing forward gun, with another shell punching a hole in the boiler room. With her captain dead and the forward part of the ship aflame, Lieutenant Peyton Jones resolved that, since she couldn't join the other destroyers in a high-speed attack run, Achates would instead remain with the convoy and continue to make smoke to cover it. But, even as damage control parties made good the initial damage, more shells from Hipper rained down, and Achates began to take on a list to port as shrapnel from the hail of high-explosive shells drove the crew under cover. The convoy altered course to move more southwards, and the 3 operational O-class made another dummy torpedo run, which intimidated Hipper into breaking off and firing on them instead. With the German cruiser falling back, the 3 British destroyers in turn fell back to cover the convoy, as the trawler Northern Gem moved in to assist the Achates, which was nonetheless rapidly sinking, and so the assistance quickly became a rescue mission. They had to act fast, as the freezing water sapped the survivors of energy. One of Achates' crew recalled, "I was so numb, I waited for the swell to take me up to the net, and then I just pushed my arms and legs through the mesh and was left hanging there until 2 ratings came down over the side and pulled me aboard, with a third helping me up by the hair. I flopped on the deck, and then the numbness started wearing off and the cold hit me. I've never before or since felt anything like the pain that racked my body." Another remembered, "The hands just couldn't do what the brain told them to. Some of the wounded had managed to get to the Gem's side, and we tried to get them up first, but after a while it was each man for himself. I had a line thrown over me, and thankfully didn't do anything other than take 2 turns around my forearm and stick the end in my mouth. I was 22 at the time." It wasn't just a matter of time for the survivors either. The Northern Gem's crew, as noted, were climbing down to haul the half-frozen Achates crewmen aboard, but this meant they themselves were subjected to the freezing sea. As they wrapped their legs in the netting and reached down to haul men out of the water, the roll of their ship meant that they were being repeatedly dunked in the ocean. Soon, a stream of survivors and half-frozen trawler crew were being moved down to the compartments around the ship's boiler to try and get them to warm up again. The most medical help available came from 1 ordinary seaman whose total medical experience consisted of the fact that he was married to a nurse and had some friends ashore who happened to be doctors. But it was better than nothing. At this stage in proceedings, Lutzow appeared to finally remember she was in fact a warship, and made to engage the convoy. But it was too late, as Barents' cruisers arrived from the north. Having tracked proceedings via radar, he swung his ships to starboard to match Hipper's course at a range of just under 12,000 yards, and opened fire. Thanks to cover from the weather and the use of reduced flash propellant, the first thing Kumets knew of this new threat was when 6-inch shells started raining down all around him. Hipper was just heading northwest to avoid another fake torpedo run from the 3 operational O-class, and responded with a single salvo before looping around under her own smoke and heading southwest. The British gunnery had been good. A 6-inch shell had damaged part of the machinery, causing one of Hipper's boilers to go offline as water flooded the fuel feed, which forced the starboard turbine to shut down from lack of power. This dropped the ship's speed. Other hits set her on fire as volatile materials in the aircraft storage area caught aflame. Caught between the new arrivals and the continuing defiance of the remaining destroyers of the convoy, Kumets ordered all ships to break off the action and retreat west at 11:37. The Sheffield and Jamaica were left briefly without a target as Hipper's smoke obscured her, but then the German destroyers Friedrich Eckholt, fresh from finishing off the Bramble, and Richard Beitzen appeared. They'd also lost contact with the larger German ships, and since up until this point the only large warships that they themselves had seen had been friendlies, they thought Barents cruisers were Hipper and Lutzow and moved to join up with them. Seeing two German destroyers apparently closing on them, Barents showed none of the hesitation of Kumets and instead drove at them with all guns blazing, passing by the unfortunate German ships at such close range that even the pom-poms were sweeping their decks and the 6-inch guns were depressed beyond their official limits to keep up their fire. The Eckholt was torn apart in minutes, with the Beitzen, a little further away, managing to beat a hasty retreat and survive. Lutzow, meanwhile, having received the order to withdraw, instead decided to open fire for the first time. But instead of helping Hipper against Barents cruisers, she instead took pot shots against some of the convoy's merchant ships. But the best it achieved here was a few splinters from near misses that hit the freighter Calobra to very little effect. The British destroyers laid another smokescreen covering the convoy before heading off in pursuit of the retreating Germans. Kumets repeated his signal to withdraw at 11:48, but Lutzow instead opted to now engage in a gunnery duel with the British destroyers for 10 minutes, before the latter decided that, with the Kriegsmarine forces heading away from the convoy, their work was clearly done, and they broke off the action to head back to the merchant ships. Force R, however, was under no such restrictions and pressed on after the German ships, spotting Hipper at about 21,000 yards, briefly, before the weather closed in again. Then, at 12:23, two German destroyers were seen at about 9,000 yards, and Barents ships moved to close them down, only to then find Lutzow emerging out of the regathering darkness behind the destroyers. Sheffield and Jamaica thus engaged her, Hipper joined in, and although Lutzow's gunnery was poor, Hipper's was good, and faced with a mixture of 8-inch and 11-inch fire versus his own 6-inch guns, plus the Germans looking like they might try to split Force R off from the convoy, Barents altered course to drop out of range while staying between Kumets and the convoy, and also keeping a radar lock, with the last shots being fired at 12:36 and the final radar contact broken at 1400. Worried that the light cruiser Nürnberg might also be around somewhere, Barents patrolled south for a bit, but the battle was over. The convoy's merchantmen would all reach their destination undamaged, while the surviving escorts patched up battle damage and took stock. Northern Gem came alongside Obdurate in rough weather to allow the latter's doctor to jump over to treat the survivors of Achates, with the trawler then being subjected to such heavy weather that the doctor had to be physically held in position by some of the crew so that he could operate using both hands, with a patient strapped down on mess tables. Sherbrooke would be awarded the Victoria Cross for his part in seeing off Hipper's initial attack, and for staying at his post after being wounded. He recovered sufficiently to rejoin naval service and would later retire in the mid-1950s as a rear admiral. It might not surprise many of you to learn that prior to commanding Onslow, he'd spent the war commanding tribal-class destroyers, including HMS Cossack at the Battle of Narvik, which might go some way to explaining his extremely aggressive defence of the convoy. The Admiralty pointed out in their subsequent analysis that although the British ship's task was defensive, they'd spent most of the action acting in a highly aggressive manner, while the Germans, whose sole reason for being there in the first place was aggressive, had played very defensively for most of the engagement. Apparently, this was a sentiment that was shared on both sides. Upon hearing of the engagement, and from the BBC no less, as Kumets kept radio silence until he got back into port, Hitler was apoplectic, ordering the wholesale scrapping of the surface fleet in the face of its apparent uselessness, with their guns to be stripped off and used for shore batteries. Admiral Raeder failed to persuade him otherwise, and resigned. Admiral Dönitz was then placed in command, and although he did manage to save some of the Kriegsmarine's surface forces, work on the carrier Graf Zeppelin and upgrading and repairing the damaged Gneisenau was abandoned permanently, and Hipper, recalled to Germany for repairs, would never re-enter frontline service. All in all, then, it was a successful start to the resumed Arctic convoys from the Allied perspective, and it was a trend that would continue. JW52, 53, 54A, 54B, 55A and 55B would not lose a single merchant ship while in transit, and JW55B would, almost exactly a year later, see the destruction of the Scharnhorst, with a number of ships from the Barents Sea engagement present once again, including Sheffield, Jamaica, Onslow, Orwell, Opportune and Matchless, with Admiral Burnett also making a reappearance, this time aboard HMS Belfast.